Hello and welcome to Mrs. AB Literature, Mrs. Brown's online YouTube tutorials. Just a couple of little notes here before we start. I'd like you obviously to look at the YouTube tutorial, work through the tutorial on YouTube, take some notes, and you'll be set some activities that you'll need time to do. Just pause the tutorial, and when you're ready to restart, once you've done the work, you can continue. You may be asked to download another document. They'll be made available for you. So if that's the case, please make sure you download those before you start the tutorial. Okay, let's begin. So today we are focusing for the A-level literature specification A, the paper 2B, the prose extract, analysis of an unseen prose extract. The extract we're going to be looking at today is from a book called Revolutionary Road, written by Richard Yates. So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be analysing. I'm going to be taking you through some of the stages, the step-by-step guides to answering the question, and we'll be looking at an exemplar answer to see what you think about how they've tackled the AOs. Finally, we will be looking at some structural methods the writers might use, which is especially useful when looking at these unseen extracts. That's to add to some of the theory we looked at in terms of character and narrative perspective last time I spoke to you. Okay, I've left the keywords on here. Again, it's worth making a note of these. These don't change really for this unit. We probably will add to it, but again, for this unit, for this particular extract, we are still looking at some of those perspectives, some of those features, such as representation of identity, for example, or historicism and globalisation. So be prepared to use those as we continue. Okay, a quick do now activity. What sorts of themes and ideas would you expect from a novel entitled Revolutionary Road? Think about the connotations of that title, and then also I've just given you a little tiny bit of context here. The novel was written in 1961. And it was set just a little bit before in America in 1955. So can you make any other links to your ideas about the kind of connotations of Revolutionary Road? When you've finished this, then you just stop the tutorial now, and then when you've finished your notes, you can continue. Okay, interesting to know what you found out. Obviously, looking at the word revolutionary here, the suggestion here is if something's revolutionary, it's something that's new, it's something that's different. The word revolution actually comes from the Latin, which means kind of to roll on. So a revolution is an idea of complete change. Something that is, if you have a revolutionary experiment or an invention, that is something that potentially could promote complete change in society. But what we have here is a nice alliteration as well with the title. Thank you, Mr. Yates. But we've also got the idea here of a road. So is this a road to revolution, or is it that you're striking out on a road in order to change yourself? I'm sure you sort of came up with some of those ideas yourself, but that's to add to it. And the setting of the novel, we will look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So I'm not going to talk too much about that now because we're going to come back to it. Okay, our outcomes are, eventually you're going to be writing an essay on this. So our outcomes are pretty important. We're going to look back at these probably later on when we look at the student exemplar. For a band 2, the examiners are looking for you to comment simply the keywords there, using all of the AOs. For a band 3, they were looking for relevant analysis. So something that's relevant, but perhaps not something that's not too inventive or creative or new in the way that you're analysing. And then coherent and thorough is they're looking for depth, they're looking for clear understanding, they're looking for clear interpretation. The word coherent actually does mean clear, so that's probably a key word as well. And then finally, for that top band, we're looking for you to be analysing in a perceptive way. That key word keeps coming up again and again. Perceptive means really insightful, the sort of thing that, most people perhaps wouldn't see. So it's that sense of really illuminating your analysis. Okay, I'm just going to move on. Alright, so here is the question. Now, if you've downloaded the extract, you should have this question in front of you, so you don't need to rewrite it. But the question gives you, as you know, a little bit of background to the extract, because obviously you've not read it before. And then it gives you the question proper. So I've put those both on the PowerPoint slide here, but you do have them. So it says, read the extract carefully. It's taken from Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates, which was first published in 1961. The novel, set in suburban America in 1955, follows the hopes and aspirations of Frank and April Wheeler, who see themselves as very different from their suburban neighbours and plan to escape their dull existence by moving to Paris so that Frank can find himself. And then the question itself says, explore the significance of the emptiness of modern life in this extract. Remember to include in your answer relevant detailed analysis of the ways that Yeats shapes meanings. Okay, so step one, my normal step-by-step guide that you're used to now in the yellow boxes. Step one suggests just to have a go at looking at that question, read and highlight the key words in the question, annotate that contextualisation. The examiners give it to you for a purpose, so make sure you use it because it will inform your essay answer. And then link ideas to the representation of modern identity and modern society, remembering that this exam paper is focused around this idea of 1945 to present and how identity and society has been sort of recreated and created through literature. And then finally, as you're annotating, think about the context of production and typical texts of the times from around about 1945. You will have read some of those, so some of these you'll be able to draw on those too. So I'll leave you just to spend some time annotating those two things, pick out those keywords and annotate the sort of contextualisation there, and then you can restart the tutorial when you're ready. Okay, so still on step one, I'm just going to go through some of the things that I have highlighted myself. So firstly, let's look at the question. I tend to look at this first. It probably doesn't matter which order you put it in, this or the contextualisation first. I just think that the question here, if you're looking, you get the question steer right, you will be starting to think about that as you're reading the contextualisation and then obviously the extract as well. So I do it in this order. So first of all, let's look at some keywords. So our question steer is the emptiness of modern life. That's what we've got to look at. That's what we've got to focus our argument on. We've got to start thinking about, does this extract express emptiness as a modern condition? How does the literature do that? And so on and so on. So we've got to keep that in mind. The second thing is significance. Now, where a question asks you to explore the significance, there is an argument embedded in that question. In this case, it's how important, I guess, is the analysis or this representation of emptiness in the extract, or how, twist it round a little bit, how important is the extract in highlighting the emptiness in modern life. So do play around with the wording of this question a bit so that you can start forming arguments from it. We'll see this later. This is really important. Modern life is mentioned here, okay, back to the idea of this exam paper from 1945 to present. So what we're looking at here is, that synchronic historicism, that idea of, how do texts present life and the aspects and the facets of modern life from that time frame. So there does need a comment on that sort of society for AO3. And then looking again at the command words here, obviously the command word at the beginning is explore. So again, we're looking at something that requires exploration. But we're after that detailed analysis, which will provide that exploration in your essay. So, it does say you've got to have clear focus on the extract, and there is here that idea of clear focus on the writer's methods. And then finally, there is a focus in here on shapes, meanings. So for the AO2 criteria, looking at engaging in meanings and messages for the modern and the contemporary reader. Now, contemporary reader here means anybody that was reading it in 1961 when it was published. Have things changed since that time? Is there, has society moved on? There's all sorts of questions that you can look at in terms of, readers today in millennium, post-millennial society, and also readers in the 1960s, around the middle of the 20th century. You can also look at the difference between an American and an English, a British context there as well. And then just again reiterating there that the whole question invites debate, so turn it into a question that deals with the bigger picture. Examiners are very keen on this idea of the bigger picture. Why study literature? What is the importance of literature in looking at this aspect, this theme of modern life, this idea of emptiness? So I always like to sort of turn it around and think, to what extent is this literature, and literature as a whole, an appropriate medium for expressing questions of modern identity? Why do we read? What does it give us? What does it add to in terms of our lives and in terms of our existence? Turn it into that bigger picture to see if you can get that sort of addressed in your essays. Okay. So the second part of that, or the first part, if you look at the way the question's structured in the exam, is the contextualization. All right, so the first thing that I might look at here is any typicality. So start thinking in the back of your mind, are there any other texts that I've read that deal with any of these themes here? This idea of sort of emptiness. Anybody that's read any sort of existential literature, that deals with, or nihilism, that deals with this idea of, emptiness in our society, or a disconnection with our society. Those of you that have studied Perfume, for example, it's a later novel, but there's similar sort of ideas coming out of that. But the one that I chose in terms of typicality was The Death of a Salesman, written by Arthur Miller. It was written and set in the late 1940s, so just post-war America, and focuses on the salesman, but the idea that he doesn't fit into modern society. He's a man who was comfortable in pre-war America, but in post-war America, where things were changing so much, there were so many people that found themselves disconnected. And sort of lacking in roots, lacking in a sense of purpose in their lives. And Death of a Salesman really focuses on that. Another one that you could look at that you will have seen is the idea of Blanche in A Streetcar Named Desire. So as you're thinking about this contextualization, are there any other texts that deal with similar ideas? And that will obviously then hit your AO4. Okay, so going back to the idea of context. So published in 1961, set in 1955, not much before. Historical context, well, people who were living in the 1960s there would still, not only would they remember the war and the wars, they would have probably been involved in the war, as we can tell from the extract with Frank, who since coming back from the war has got this sense of disconnectedness and fracturedness regarding his how his memories don't match up to his expectations of modern life. We've also got additional freedom here. So in the 1960s there was the start of more freedom for different groups in society. We're looking at sort of feminism and how feminism is developing across time. The contraceptive pill, whilst not actually in popular usage in the 1960s, early 60s, it was being developed, and the widespread use wasn't that far off, which revolutionised the way that men and women and relationships worked, not only in America but also in many societies. But what we have to look at is that marriage was still that dominant institution. Divorce laws hadn't been relaxed in the early 1960s. And in fact, after the Second World War, we have the rise of the baby boomers, so that kind of centrality of the family, where lots and lots of people were actually sort of born in those post-war years, as probably as a result of the separation that happened before up until 1945. Other things then, social sort of context here. Well, travel was more likely at that time. In the 1960s, there seemed to be a fascination with this idea of Paris culture, and people started to escape suburban life. There was a book called Breathless in Paris about a female, a woman who broke away from suburban life and went to go and find herself in Paris. This idea of sort of travel and being able to travel and experience new things to obtain that freedom that perhaps you don't get in a restrictive sort of suburban conformism that perhaps many people were still subject to in the 1960s. But there were freedoms starting in the 1960s. So one obvious example, it actually happened earlier, but people will have remembered rationing. They would have remembered what it was like not to be able to eat eggs, for example, and have to have powdered eggs, or not eat sweets, or be rationed for their bread or their flour. The rationing there, I've put the dates on there, stopped in 1946 in the US, but it was actually 1954 in the UK, so quite a lot later. So in a time where the restrictions of the Second World War were starting to give way to a little bit more freedom. People had a little bit more of a hedonism, I suppose, about them, perhaps. Okay, now it's interesting how they put this statement here. And plan to escape the dull existence by moving to Paris so that Frank can find himself. So this idea again of, journey. If you've seen one of my other videos, I've just talked about this. The journey as a metaphor. That journey is not just that physical journey, it's also that emotional journey that comes with new experiences. And the idea here that in the extract, which you will read in a second, is that Frank seems to be isolated, not from other people, but from his own sense of identity and culture. And he's searching for something. We'll see this very clearly in the extract when we read it. Now, all of that we've done. I'm just seeing if there's anything else. Oh, hang on. Postmodernism. I forgot about that. How can we forget? So just place this book in its postmodern context. So it was written in 1955. It's postmodernism tends to have started around about the end of the Second World War, but with real change in style. Now, I'm not suggesting this text is radical or different in its structure and the way that it presents its genre. Although some people would argue it's actually quite psychological. We do have a sense of reaction to kitsch. Now, if you don't know what kitsch is, how can I explain kitsch? It's kind of everyday tat. I don't know whether it has any sort of reference to the rise in the production of plastic in the middle of the 20th century, but this idea of celebrating what's kind of surface level, and enjoying that kind of, fun and freedom that you get with not having to worry about high culture, but also the idea of hybrid genres. And this, which I think is important for this extract, is this idea of self-reflexivity, a theory that was presented by a postmodern theorist later than this, actually, called Anthony Giddens. And the idea here is that when you get more freedom in society, you also get more risk. So I always use the example of give somebody a packet of salt and vinegar crisps and a packet of cheese and onion crisps and tell them to choose. They're likely to know more or less what the flavours are and will choose the one they like best. There's not a lot of risk involved in that. If I then get a bunch of packets of crisps that have got like those flavours, plus Worcester sauce, plus hedgehog flavour, plus my favourite pickled onion Monster Munch, and various others like sort of chilli and paprika and so on, and ask them to choose, they may not have actually experienced that freedom of choice before. So there's a little bit more risk because they don't know whether they like it or not. And most people will take a reasoned decision, and this is what we call self-reflexivity. So if you introduce more risk to society, you also introduce more self-awareness about how you deal with that freedom and that risk. And I think that there is an element of that going on in here in this extract. So have a look to see if you can see it, where that freedom and that choice actually does present maybe an element of risk. And this is a feature of later postmodern ideas. Okay, so believe it or not, we haven't actually read the text yet. So we've dealt with the in loads of detail in the question. In the exam, you'll do this quicker, and that's fine. But we do need now to read the text, start annotating, and think about what stands out. So in the similar way to how you've dealt with the W questions, perhaps of the Unseen Poetry unit, I want you to have a read of this and get a feel for the messages, the values, the representations. Read the text as you're reading, annotate just what stands out to you. Don't worry about other things at the moment. And see if you can answer some of those W questions. And the other thing I do, which you can see on the example there, which is a screen print of a picture of some of my annotations, is I just tag those paragraphs to get a sense of the structure, so I can see the order in which the writer is dealing with ideas. We'll come back to this a bit later on. Okay, so stop the tutorial here, perhaps just spend some time annotating the extract and reading, just to immerse yourself in it and think about those W questions. When you're ready, restart, and we'll continue with the annotations and the step-by-step guide. Okay, so what I've done here is I've shown you my just my paragraph tags, I suppose. You'll probably have something different, and that's absolutely fine, because this is the beauty of studying literature, is different things stand out to different people. If you just take a minute, you can have a look at what I've annotated. If you like it, you fancy writing it down, you can do, but there's no right or wrong here. It is just a case of let's, sort of focus on what stands out to us. Okay, so once we've immersed ourselves in the text, we now need to annotate in a bit more detail. So our step 3 is have a reread now and annotate the writer's methods that link to the question. So I'm going to do I've got a couple of slides on this in a second. So we'll do that, and then we'll kind of fill in any gaps in the annotations as we go through. So last week, when I last saw you, we focused on characterisation. today we're going to do a little bit of core teaching just on those structural features that you see, that hopefully you may have started to pick out if you've tagged your paragraphs. So, a quick recap then. This is what we covered last time on the characterisation. So we're still on step 3. This is about annotating the extract. So have a look at those features that we covered last time. You may also want to think about narrative perspective, although it's quite difficult in this text in some respects, because a lot of the text is based around a dialogue between April and Frank. So, but you will be able to get some sort of perspective, some sort of narrative perspective from there as well. So perhaps add that to it as well. So again, I'll just give you a few minutes to use those prompts there to have a look at your extract and start doing your annotation based on character. When you've finished that, then restart the tutorial. Okay, so what does structure mean actually? Now you've all done questions on this in your GCSE. It's the question that people don't like, but I actually do. So what does structure mean? Well, on a simple level, it's the way the writer orders the subject matter, which you've tagged already on your paragraphs. It is also the internal organisation of a text. So, are there any strands or echoes running through the text? Are there any, motifs that crop up more than once that seem to build the links in the structure? And obviously we're talking about an extract here from a novel, Unseen Prose, but you can look at this in other texts as well, so the poem and the play, and thinking just how it's been, and I use the word bolted together, so how has it been, sort of structured, put together. The other thing that you need to look at in terms of AO2 is form. Now often form and structure are very closely linked. So for example, you might get a poem that's a sonnet, and the form of that sonnet, takes the form of a 14-line poem with often quite a structured rhyming scheme that usually follows iambic pentameter and so on and so on. Okay, so your sonnet is the form, and then you can explore the structure within that form. A novel or a short story or unseen, the prose that we're actually looking at does a similar sort of job. So we're going to look in a little bit more detail here at some of the features of prose fiction and the structural methods that writers might use. So there are two levels, broad levels of structure. The first one is dynamic and the second one is symmetric. Okay, so for dynamic structure, we're looking at sequences of events. It's usually a cause and effect. So what happens, what's the effect of that? So what actions happen in the plot that drive that plot forward? The symmetric structure is the threads that run through the text. So for example, any parallel images or repeated images that you might find, any juxtapositions, any repeated cross-references or exophoric reference, so reference outside the text, any sort of patterns of language that might be occurring, so perhaps like an extended simile, for example. Now these also help shape and create the text, and you'll see some examples of this in our Revolutionary Road extract. These are probably some of the features, the writer's methods for structure that you will have come across at GCSE. So this is just a repetition of that. So we've got our cause and effect there, that dynamic structure, but there are some other things that you will have come across before. Foreshadowing, foregrounding. Prolepsis and analepsis are flash forward, prolepsis and flash back. Which you can use in terms of a terminology, that's not a problem. But look out for any temporal shifts in the text. Is there a kind of a memory that crops up? We do see this in this extract. Is there a shift in pace? And what you'll notice on this list is structure is often not about what's there, it's about the study of changes. It's about how that narrative shifts and changes ideas, pace, tone, atmosphere, perspectives, emotion, etc. If you look at how many times on that list the word shift or change occurs, you can see that what we're looking at here is that look at the borderline between those changes. What happens at that point? It's that's going to get your meaningful analysis of structure. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now, again, is to stop the tutorial and have a look at your extract now and see if you can find any of these features that I've just mentioned. Don't just feature spot them. I want to know why they're there. Why has the writer used that particular change or that shift in time? What is the point of it? Okay, so stop the tutorial and then restart it when you're ready to move on. So it's just a summary here of the dynamic structure. You can talk about it in terms of chronology, the order of chronological time, or narrative time, the order in which the story unfolds. And these are not always the same. So sometimes the story will unfold in a different structure to chronology, to sort of linear time. The symmetric structure, there's some focuses there that you could look at. So any sort of foreshadowing in Shakespeare, you've all come across dramatic irony. That is a form of symmetric structure, where the mentioning of ideas or telling the reader, in Shakespeare's case the audience, elements of the plot before the characters knows creates this sort of irony that builds a sense of pathos as you're watching the play. But other things, so symbolism, for example, if that's a repeated symbol or a repeated motif running through the prose structure here. Interesting to see if you found any in Revolutionary Road. So again, I'm just going to give you a minute, stop the tutorial to see if you can add anything else based on those last two slides to your annotations, and restart the tutorial when you're ready. Okay, so here are my thoughts. I've picked 4 things. Obviously this is probably too much for an A-level essay, but if you get something integrated and it's integrated with other points, then perhaps it would be quite good in terms of developing that coherence and that depth that they're looking for the higher level bands. So I've picked out the first and the last line. So the first line is, the whole country's rotten with sentimentality. That's direct speech from Frank. And then finally we've got this sort of prose, this reported action from the narrator, from the omniscient narrator, that says he took her in his arms and the evening was over. I always find looking at the first and the last lines quite interesting, because then you can look at, especially in an extract, you can look at the journey that the extract has taken from beginning to end. So how have we as a reader changed, and how have the characters changed from beginning to end? Or indeed, have they changed? So I like this because we've got a clear complaint at the beginning from Frank. The hypocrisy there is actually shown, because if you're a hypocrite, you say one thing, but actually you go against what you say in your actions, perhaps. And we've got this here. There is a disjunction between his criticisms of American kitsch culture, that culture that says, where are the values anymore that he talks about? Everybody's kind of smiling through this easy way out kind of life that he talks about in the first large paragraph there. It's quite cyclical. So it starts with sentimentality in his criticism, but it actually ends with his actions. So this kind of, sort of haptics of him actually sort of taking her in his arms, and, the whole cliche there of that romantic exchange that they have, which is like full of sentimentality. So Frank is a hypocrite. just makes you wonder how his journey to Paris will hold up if he's actually wants to find something, to get away from something, but the whole values of the culture that's around him are actually part of him himself that he's not going to be able to get away from. We've got use of analepsis several times during this extract. It starts off with, and again, of course, this is from the narrative perspective, Frank said one night, which suggests that it is a retrospective, it's time in the past, and of course it is in the past tense. And later on it says another time quite late, which is on the second page, about sort of 2/3 of the way up. And then it goes on to say he walked up close to the sofa and sat down on the edge of the coffee table facing her. So this is another time, but again, a suggestion there is that all of this is retrospective. And then we actually switch back into Frank's memories itself when he says, the quotation there, I felt like this going up the line the first time in the war. And we get a sequence of writing all about how, he should have felt terrified, and he was terrified, but he had this, and the quote is, he had this terrific sense of life. So he's reliving those memories of being in the war. And if you know a war veteran, you know that actually that does happen, that those moments, they were so intense in their history that often it shapes all of their lives, their present lives. And they do talk about it. You just have to look at Only Fools and Horses. I think it's their uncle that said he was a sailor in the Second World War, and how he kept talking about it all the time. A little bit more about sort of the general structure. It is a form here. The form is a two-way conversation. I've written just there because actually poor April doesn't say very much. There's standard adjacency pairs. An adjacency pair is two parts exchanging a conversation. So Frank says something and April responds to it. But Frank has the longer length of utterance, suggesting that this is traditional in terms of a relationship. The woman defers to the man. In fact, the quotation there, if you look at your extract where it says exactly, she said, enraptured with him, suggests that he is the centre of her life. Now, potentially, if you think in terms of the time it was written in 1960s, there could be a comment here on sort of feminism and the build-up of feminism that would have been happening in the 20th century. But what we can argue is that women in suburban America were still expected to marry and settle into a domestic life. So if we talk about the idea of emptiness in this question, it just makes you wonder, what is the emptiness here? Is their marriage empty? I don't know. I mean, actually you could argue it's not. Which gives you a sort of a second part of the hypothesis, doesn't it? Is what is emptiness? What are we talking about here? And is April just feeling just as empty as Frank? But we can argue that she defers to him. And then finally, in terms of the structure, there is a switch or a style shift somewhere around on the second page where it says he paused for a deep-throated laugh. When you think how close we came to settling into that sort of existence, presents a shift. They've just gone through this big criticism of modern American society through the moniker of calling people the Donaldsons, as opposed to Mr. and Mrs. or John J. Donaldson. So this idea here that he's then shifting, he's saying how restricted life is in America, and then he shifts to trying to talk about his freedom and what he understands and what he wants from being free, which presumably precipitates his revolutionary road to Paris. Okay, So I know this seems a bit long-winded. Obviously in the exam it gets a lot quicker, but we're now on to step 4, and it's Mrs. Brown's good old continuum scale to build an argument. So I don't need to tell you that you need to build your thesis carefully, and if the sliding scale helps, then use it. So what I've done in the grey box here is I've just rephrased this statement, which is explore the significance of emptiness of modern life in this extract, and I've phrased it into a kind of question. So I've written this extract deals with the characteristic emptiness of modern life. I've added the word characteristic in there because I think that works in the idea of significance, that emptiness is a characteristic, or is it, I guess is what you're asking. And then I've written on the end of that to what extent do you agree, which makes this sliding scale, this continuum scale, really easy to work with. So you put agree on one end and disagree on the other. Okay, so again, just stop the tutorial. Having read this extract now, where would you place yourself in line with that sort of argument? And then give yourself a reason why. Restart the tutorial once you're ready to continue. So I've placed myself around about, I've actually put myself nearer to agree, and I kind of argued with myself on this about whether I agreed or disagreed, because there is this whole idea of what do we mean by emptiness, which I grappled with when I was looking at this. But I've placed myself here that I do, to a certain extent, I do agree with that. And then I've put my reasoning underneath. I think it's clear that Frank has a yearning for freedom from this kind of drudgery and that he finds in his everyday life. But I just think literature's doing more than just looking at a man who's trying to be free from that. I think what it's doing here is reflecting on the idea that humanity often creates emptiness, so a person will create emptiness themselves because they have high expectations about how they want to live their life. And this is all kind of connected with the idea of lack of belonging and lack of roots, and also this idea of, you know, when you feel disjointed with where your roots are and where your culture is. And I think Frank is an example of a restless man. He wants more, and because he wants more, it results in emptiness. It's interesting, again, a lot of postmodern theorists look at the kind of idea of modern life and say that we have changed, our expectations have changed, and the war years actually were quite instrumental in doing that, in that, you know, sort of early 20th century, people stayed with people for life. They stayed where they were for life. They stayed in the same job for life because that's what they expected. But after that Second World War, where people had suffered and where people had risked their lives, I guess some people were thinking, well, is it all worth it? If we're not happy in our situation, maybe it's time to change. But that creates high expectations. It creates high expectations of happiness. And I think we've got Frank as an example here of that kind of hole that he's got in his soul because he expects more than he's actually getting. It's interesting because April is a kind of character foil, I think. She seems to be more content with those traditional roles, and that's shown by her hero worship of him. Again, with that quotation where she's enraptured with him. Alright, so I've given you some ideas. So you've probably got your own ideas, and that's absolutely fine. This, of course, will then build into your introduction, which should always follow that focus of what's your thesis, what's your challenge, are there any challenges to that thesis, so the counter-argument, and also what are the messages to the readers. So that 3-point introduction, thesis, antithesis and message, should always come up in your introduction. Okay, so when you're happy with what you've got and all your notes, feel free to move on. If you need to take any more notes, then just stop the tutorial and restart it when you're ready. Okay, so step 5, I would normally number my points on my annotations rather than doing a mind map, but you can do a quick mind map if you want. You do need to remember obviously the time pressures in the exam, that you only have around about 45 minutes to write this answer. So your planning does need to be quick. I've gone through this very slowly, but you'll take the steps that are useful to you, and what you think is going to be useful to your own building for your essay. Now again, planning your essay, that you've seen this kind of plan before, it may not fit like this, but I think that the bullet points here are useful in just thinking about focuses that you can look at in your essay question that actually link to the criteria. So again, if you need to make a note of those, if you haven't already got them on the previous notes, then please do so. When you're ready, restart the tutorial and we'll continue finally, just as a plenary, just looking at an example answer and what you think about it. Okay, finally, we've got a paragraph here, so if I could just very quickly go back, the student there is looking at character insight paragraph in the plan. This is one that I've picked up off the internet, I think, from AQA. So my question is the student covering all the AOs, and if they're not, which ones are they missing? And what he does cover, does he do a good job of it? So I'm going to read it to you. As I read, you won't have this in front of you unless you want to sort of take a screen print it out, you can. But just be thinking about which AO each point is hitting. Frank represents a man who has a lack of identity within his contemporary world. Yates tells us when Frank is recounting his war experiences, he pretended to be scared. He is trying to fit in with the rest of the soldiers. The use of the verb pretended could symbolise the way he tries to not fit in, that it appears forced. That's hard to say. He says, I was scared, of course, but that's not the point. He's trying to give more meaning to a simple emotion. The writer does this to perhaps criticise people who want to adhere to strict social rules. He is presenting a male character who conforms to gender roles because he doesn't want to show that he is scared. In comparison, Yates develops the theme of masculinity in a previous paragraph where Frank is questioning, is it any wonder men end up emasculated? The use of the rhetorical question here, he is not expecting April to respond, allows the reader to ponder on whether men of his time are becoming less masculine, and Yates could be questioning whether this is a bad thing. Alternatively, whilst he is questioning, he is more talking at April than engaging in an equal conversation with his wife, which presents a stereotypical dominant patriarchal relationship conventional of the time. In traditional literature, the typicality of the male dominance is apparent, whereas Frank feels he is losing his identity because people were becoming more liberal in the 1960s, and for older generations, modernisation and changing values are revolutionising the world we live in. Perhaps, therefore, the title Revolutionary Road is therefore more metaphorical of life, and Frank and April's existence merely a microcosm of the larger world. Okay, so there's a lot in that. We've clearly got AO2 embedded there with the analysis of the verb, the use of the questioning there as well. So and really useful quotations. They've not just picked one quotation and then moved on with it. So again, for AO1, we've got that sort of analysis of the extract and response to the extract is quite well done. We also have typicality. So for AO4, it's not brilliant, but it's all right. In traditional literature, the typicality of the male dominance is apparent. That kind of literary context is quite nice there, and quite a lot of context embedded. AO5, we've got an alternative viewpoint. It's not perhaps analysed in as much detail as we would like, but clearly we've got that too. So it's okay as a it's not a bad answer, this one. I think there's more that could be done with it. So perhaps now have a look yourself before you finish this tutorial, just at some of the things you might suggest he does that are different. You can tell it's a student answer. There's a couple of errors in it as well, which I haven't changed. So okay, so when you've finished, that's the end of the tutorial, and thank you very much for listening.